Unplug this? Okay. Okay. Everyone can hear me. I can hear a little too much of me. So I have actually spent most of my life putting a lot of time and effort into avoiding this word. And the reason is because it's supremely uncomfortable. And even if I have a great relationship with someone, the first time that I think about having to approach them with some kind of potential conflict, I have a physical reaction, like someone is grabbing your stomach while simultaneously punching you in the heart. But what I've learned is that sometimes it's those conversations that are actually the richest ones. It's especially when we engage in those divergent points of view that we learn more. And those are the conversations that have pushed me and helped me to grow the most. Now, I know that most of what I'm talking about right now is really about human to human or personal conflict. But it's just as hard when it happens in the work environment as well. And unfortunately for me, especially when I became a manager, I came to find that engaging in conflict would have to become a natural part of my job and necessary. So for the past couple of years, I've been working at Netflix and at Spotify, where data is really embraced. And sometimes data and design are seen as opposing forces, things that are different from each other. But what I've actually found is that working at the intersection of these two worlds has actually helped to push my creative process forward. And actually, that agitating the creative process with a little bit of thoughtful and conscientious conflict is actually very, very beneficial, and it actually facilitates and encourages richer conversations to happen, not just with your peers, but sometimes with yourself. So what I'm going to share with you today are 5 things that I've learned along the way about dealing with conflict. Some of this conflict might be about data and design, some of it is just about people. So hopefully it'll be helpful. Okay, so one thing about the slides, if you're wondering about the Japanese theme, it's not because I'm Japanese. I am Japanese. But actually, the Japanese theme is because I did this talk. I was working on this talk while I was on vacation in Japan. And so one thing is that if you're working on a talk when you're on vacation, you can use your vacation photos as slides, and it's royalty free, so that's all good. Also, one thing to mention is that my family is not represented by the 2 kids here in the foreground, but they're actually represented by the small child who is photobombing them in the back. There, you can see it. Okay. So the first thing about conflict is that before you engage in it, you want to make sure that the battle that you're going to have is going to be worthwhile. We all know that in any creative process, there's going to be some kind of conflict along the way, whether it's with someone else in your team, another team in the company, or maybe even with yourself. And so before you go through the effort of donning your armor and putting on all of these weapons, right, it's important to make sure that the battle that you're going into is something that you really believe in and that you think is worth fighting for. Now, as designers, we often say, it's really important to frame the problem correctly. Ask us, how can we cross this river? Don't tell us to build a bridge or a boat, right? This is something we say often. But I'm actually saying that it's more important to first ask, why are we crossing the river? What's actually going to be on the other side? Is it going to be more of this foggy landscape? Or might we arrive at this lovely temple? And what's the goal of crossing the river? Is it to get there as fast as possible? Or is it actually that we want to have a comfortable journey that we enjoy along the way? And just like this general can't go into battle without having an army marching behind him that's all going in the same direction, If you have two teams that are arguing about crossing the river, one that is arguing to make a decision to get there as fast as possible, and another that's arguing to make a decision so they can ride there in comfort, those two teams are never going to come to a healthy resolution. So anyone here who works with data knows that one of the best ways to help align groups before you embark on a mission is to actually have very clearly stated success metrics ahead of time. And what those metrics do for you is that they help you understand what is the potential impact of what it is that we're going to do. And it also helps you measure your progress along the way. But I know that sometimes when I talk about metrics, it can feel very cold and not very human. So I've actually found that it's really useful to think about tying these metrics back to real human behavior. Now at Spotify, one of the metrics that we care most about is engagement. Daily active users divided by monthly active users, DAU over MAU. And essentially what that's doing is measuring how sticky is our product, how likely are people to come back on a regular basis. But it's not so inspiring sometimes to talk about increasing DAU over MAU. And we want to find something that actually more emotionally resonates with the people who are working on our product. And so when I first got to Spotify, one of the things that I did was to partner up with the analytics team and think about how we can articulate a metric like engagement in terms of real human behavior. So if we think about what Spotify is trying to do as a streaming music service, it's to get people to play music. And if people are coming to our product and not playing music, we can't really say that we're successful, and that's not going to lead to more engagement. This is also, therefore, much easier to get the team emotionally bought in to helping our customers and our users play more music. So the point here is that it's really important before you embark down a path where you know that there might be some conflict, to actually make sure that you understand what it is that you're fighting for, to articulate it in a way that actually you can emotionally get behind and really believe in, because you know that that journey is going to be hard. So once you know what you're fighting for, it's really important that you are able to express it well. And I know that before I go into a conflict, I feel much better about it if I'm actually prepared. At Netflix, we used to actually have a very strong culture of debate. And it's really hard to be successful in a company that has a culture of debate if you don't enjoy debate or you aren't good at it. So one of the things that the head of product and I did with our teams is that we decided that we were going to create a forum that allowed people to practice the art of debate. And I know that it's not as common here in Sweden, but in the US, we have a lot of these debate classes and debate clubs, places where there's a statement that's made, and you have teams from different schools coming and arguing for or against that statement. So we actually did the exact same thing at Netflix. We had a stage, we got podiums, we put a timer on the stage, and we made people come up on stage and actually debate each other. And we picked topics that were usually very timely, things that were in the ether. We picked topics that were slightly controversial. And the topics were things like Netflix has a culture of fear. Argue for or against that. Or that we are too dependent on data. Argue for and against that. And oftentimes, we would actually assign topics to people when it was in strong opposition of what they really believed in. So I was asked to argue against the statement that better visual design can lead to more retention. Now, not everyone, really appreciated being put on stage and having to argue with each other. And I know that it's uncomfortable. We actually did make it optional at some point. But the thing is that everyone that we saw do that got better at it. And the reason they got better is because essentially it's a performance, and you practice these things. And it was really great because it was, in fact, a safe environment because it was a performance. It was a staged fight. And honestly, there's no better way to win an argument than to be able to state your opponent's view better than they can state it themselves. Because what that really does for you is that it makes them feel that you are actually empathetic and understand where they're coming from, and therefore your reasoning must be logical. Now, in the spirit of trying to win at all costs, I would also see people become more brave, and they would actually say things that were being whispered in the hallways in order to support the arguments that they were trying to make. And that was actually also very, very liberating. So I personally loved it. The last thing here is that there's no better way to improve a skill than to actually perform it and practice it on stage in front of all your peers. So that was also very good for us. Now, being comfortable with debate is actually one of the best ways that you can actually start to vet the strengths and weaknesses of your own ideas. So I found that engaging in debate is very, very helpful. Okay, so I don't know how many of you are like me, but when I have a really great idea, the first thing that I want to do is jump up out of my seat and run down and find someone to share my idea with, because, you know, I can't be alone in basking in the glory of my mind, right? So I have to just go find someone to share that idea with. And if I'm totally honest, I usually find someone who's a kindred spirit. I find another designer, or I find someone who thinks just like me, because then we're going to high-five each other and they're totally going to get it. But in reality, this is actually the best time for you to actually seek out your enemy and share your idea with them. And I know that in those early stages of the idea, they're like these little babies, and you want to protect them, and you want to let them grow up a little bit before you start to share them with anyone who's going to tear it apart. But that's really the best time to find that person that's your enemy and throw it to the wolves. Okay, so who is your enemy? I know who my enemy is. I'm sure you all have one. This is the person who, when you see them at the coffee machine at work, you kind of go the other way. The person who you're always butting heads with, the person who just never sees it the same way as you do. So I'm sure that saying, hey, go find that person and engage them in a conversation about your precious idea doesn't sound that comfortable. But actually, engaging with your enemy at an early stage does two things for you. One, it's early enough that you're hopefully not too wed to the idea, and the stakes are therefore not that high. Wouldn't it be better to engage this person in a conversation about your idea and have them tear it down one-on-one when you're prepared, rather than in a room full of people 3 weeks later? The second thing is that whether or not you want to admit it, seeking out feedback from people is actually a sign of respect. You wouldn't want to hear what your enemy had to say unless you at least respected their opinion on some level. And that actually does help you to build a better relationship with them. Now, whenever I do this, I'm usually quite transparent. I will actually say, hey, listen, you and I don't usually see eye to eye on things, and so that's why I'm bringing this idea to you, and I want to see what happens. And what I found is that usually my opponent will actually embrace the exercise, and they don't make it as personal because I've approached them with it as an academic exercise, right? So we have a strong, great discussion, and it's healthy, and it usually goes well. So seeking out your enemy at an early stage and putting your idea forward to someone who you perceive as being the person that generally opposes you the most is really helpful in pushing those ideas further than they might have gone if you were just reinforcing those ideas with voices that sound just like yours. And it really, really helps to have you become less attached to your ideas so that you can keep your own mind open as you explore other solutions. So at some point, you do want to find a way to resolve the conflict. And there's a couple of ways that we can do this. Of course, we can always discuss it and come to consensus. Another thing is we can also pick someone to just make a decision and go forward with that. And I'm not going to make the expected joke here about Swedish versus American cultures. But when you work in my field, one of the things that we can do is say, hey, we're actually not going to decide between these two ideas internally. What we're actually going to do is put these two things forward to our users and to the public and let them decide. So essentially what I'm talking about here is something like A/B testing. Now, I know that sometimes when we talk like this, it can feel uncomfortable to take yourself out of the process of the decision making and leave that up to others, and especially leaving it up to data. But the thing is that behind every single point of data is a real person. And data is just the language that we're using to have a conversation with those people, with our users. And just like with an individual, you can have a conversation that is dull and boring, or you might have a conversation that is interesting and meaningful and that might actually push you and spark learning. It's the same thing when you're having those conversations with millions and millions of users through data. So I want to talk just a little bit more about inserting conflict or inserting competing solutions into a conversation. So when you're designing to learn, it's actually really important to present your customers with as many differentiated or opposing solutions as possible. And actually, the more clearly those differences are, the stronger a response and a clearer response you can actually elicit from your customers. And they will be able to better articulate what's important to them, and you will be better equipped to understand what matters to them. So for example, do you think it would be more interesting to have a conversation with your customers about the strawberry on the left versus the strawberry on the right? Okay? And aside from the fact that this single strawberry costs, wait, I did the conversion, costs 42 crowns, or that this single strawberry costs 25 crowns, because Japanese people pay a lot of money for fruits, it may not be that interesting a conversation. It might be more interesting to have a conversation about whether they'd prefer an apple or an orange or a strawberry, because what you're doing is you're giving them more dimensions to talk about. They can talk about color, they can talk about texture, they can talk about flavor, they can talk about taste. And I happen to only take photos of fruits, and maybe if you took photos of fish, there would be a more interesting conversation there. But having those differences be very clear and things that they can actually recognize allows you to understand what starts to really matter to them. Now, as designers, we get to choose what kinds of conversations we want to have with our customers. And so we can choose whether we're going to be talking to them about strawberries versus strawberries or apples versus oranges versus strawberries. So what I've found is that inserting conflict into these conversations and inserting these different opinions about what is right into a conversation can actually be more about learning as much as possible rather than motivated by winning the argument. Okay, so when you're in Japan, you can go to a temple and you can get your future told on these pieces of paper. And if your fortune is not good, you can actually take that piece of paper and tie it to a string at the temple so that you can leave it there and then all that bad luck won't come true. And just like when I was in Japan and I tied my fortune to this string because I got a really bad fortune, you also want to sort of do things to avoid conflict in the future, or to at least minimize it or be smart about it. So I'm going to ask you all to indulge me for a second as I tell you this story. When I was in California, I used to play Japanese drums. And they're these large drums, and you play them like this. My teacher, my sensei, was very, very strict. He was very old school Japanese, very disciplined, very scary, very strong, expected a lot of us. And I was playing in a song, and playing along, and I make a mistake. And I'm playing the same song again, and I make a mistake in the exact same spot. Play it again, and make the mistake in the same spot. So he comes marching over to me, and he says, "Hey, when you take a walk in the woods, you're walk, 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 and then bam, you hit your head on a tree. The next day, you go for the same walk in the woods, and you walk, 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 walk. Bam, hit your head on a tree. In Japan, we call this stupid. Is this not stupid in America too?" And yeah, it is stupid in America too, and it's stupid if you're walking down the same path over and over again, and you're not paying attention to your surroundings and what's going on, such that you can avoid that tree in the future. So I started to think about this and notice, when is it that I'm making the same mistake over and over again? When am I getting to the same fights over and over again? And so what we start to do is we start to look for patterns. And those patterns might be in different things. They might be patterns in the topic that you're fighting about or that you're finding conflict in. It might be a pattern in the approach or the way that you're getting into conflict, or it might be a pattern in the solutions for how you resolve those conflicts. And when we actually take a step back and see these patterns from far away, hopefully you're actually going to learn something about resolving conflict in one situation, and then you can actually apply it to others. So when we were first establishing the design team at Spotify, it was relatively new, and we found that we were trying to argue a lot for things that were important to design, but which in a company that didn't prior have a strong design voice, people just weren't accustomed to talking about. And we would say things like, design quality is really, really important. We really need to emphasize design quality. And what the rest of the company might hear is that we wanted to add 3 months of time to shipping so that we could polish up all the details. But we didn't want to add 3 months to shipping either. And so what we found is that we could start to submit UX bugs into the system, and no one really seemed to complain. So instead of getting on our soapbox every time and starting to lecture about design quality, we could just submit these bugs. And what we learned was that taking the things that were important to us and actually reframing it into the language and into the systems that were already in place from the strong tech and product culture actually helped us to get those things done and to help us communicate better. So then we start to talk about things that are like bad experiences or bad user flows as UX crashes. And this helps to facilitate the resolution of those kinds of conflicts. So it's actually important sometimes to get a little meta and to actually take that step back and analyze, why is it that we're getting into this conflict over and over again? Think about that and then apply those learnings to the future. So what I've learned about conflict is that it's mostly about a mindset. And explicitly practicing conflict actually makes it bearable, but actually embracing it allowed me to take control of it. So although I still don't love conflict, what I have found is that inserting it and embracing it and provoking it is sometimes one of the best things you can do to the creative process. Thanks.